Welcome to the Polypolitics podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Turner, where opinions are challenged and facts matter. A place for honest conversations and unfiltered perspectives. My guest today is Dr. Doug Cardell. Cardell is a economist, economic policy expert, and lifelong educator. Throughout his career, he served as an aide as a member of Congress, led a company as a corporate CEO, and taught mathematics and modeling at both the secondary and post-secondary levels. He practices what he calls evidentiary economics, starting with the evidence that works and what doesn't, rather than ideological assumptions. He's the author of the Amazon bestseller, Why Socialism Struggles, exposing the economic errors that undermine utopian ideals. Dr. Cardell, welcome to the show.
I'm happy to be here, Christopher. Good to be with you.
Perfect. Well, tell us a little about this book. I mean, the title of the book sounds like a very interesting title. Can you tell me a little bit about what your book's about?
Yeah, sure. It's basically explaining why socialism doesn't work the way socialists think it will work. It's been tried a lot of times, and there are a lot of reasons why it can't work. And we can discuss some of those as we go on, but part of the reason is a misunderstanding of economics in general. The people who advocate socialism really don't understand how economics works. And they don't understand the complexity of it. That's probably the biggest problem, is that they tend to think that it's a simple thing that can be fixed or played with. And as part of my research, I've done a study of the real personal consumption expenditures, which is a really good way to find out what people are planning. And what I found out is that the Federal Reserve, I looked at what they predicted every year, and then I looked to see what would actually happen. They were right 46% of the time. You literally could have done better flipping a coin. Now, for socialism to work, socialism is a kind of planned economy. So a socialist government would hire somebody like me and say, okay, Dr. Doug, plan the economy. Tell us how many cell phones to make, how many cars to make, what kind of cars to make. Tell us everything we need to make, and we'll tell the factories what to do. Well, if you can only get that right 46% of the time, how do you make an economy work? And I don't think it's necessary to do a complex study like mine was to see why that's true. There are right now about 9 billion people on the planet, and they're all planning to buy and sell stuff over the coming year. Here's the problem. I don't know what my wife is planning to buy next week. So how could I possibly know what 9 billion people are planning to buy next week? And therefore be able to plan accurately for how to do that. And the bottom line is I can't. And
and can I? Yeah, and I completely understand. I don't know what I'm going to buy next week. I don't know what I'm going to buy. Honestly, I don't know what I'm going to have for dinner tonight. That's actually going to be in a few hours. But I think can we start from a different spot? So like, I am not a socialist. I am a progressive, and I do have some, definitely social views. And I know a lot of my audience does too. All right. And I think maybe we should start with a little level set of like what we're talking about when we're talking about socialism, right? Because there is a big difference between the way that socialism was done in some place like Venezuela, right? Like, not Maduro's Venezuela, but prior, when they were a complete petro state, which looks a lot different than how socialism was done in, something like the Soviet Union, and which is a lot different than how we see social programs being executed in the United States, from things like rent control, in New York with Zohran Mamdani, free grocery stores, not free, obviously, but state-held grocery stores. When you're talking about socialism, what do you mean?
Well, true socialism is a system in which the government owns the means of production and all property.
Gotcha. So an entire so you're talking about an entire country that is where all the means of production is owned by the state. Right. So that's what we're talking about. So we're not talking about specific social things that are happening like in the United States. Or do you consider that socialism, or just out of curiosity?
That sort of depends. I should point out that another thing very similar to socialism is fascism. They're basically the same thing. The difference is that in fascism, the government controls the means of production and all property, but they don't outright own it. And so fundamentally, it doesn't really make any difference because the government is in charge of the economy either way. Many of the things that people would describe in the US as being socialist are really closer to fascism. That is, the government is controlling what is happening in the economy. And the problem is that government can't do that very well because we're dealing with a very, very complex system where the tiniest little bit of tinkering can screw things up. And let me give you a really good example. We learned over the last 100 years that our attempts to fix the environment ended up breaking it in virtually every case. So we thought, well, the deer population in the North Rim of the Grand Canyon isn't doing very well, so we're going to put a bounty on predators. And what happened? Well, the deer population exploded and then crashed, and we ended up with far fewer deer than we had before. So we actually were able to destroy the environment by trying to fix it. And that's the problem, is that complex systems like the economy, like the environment, involve thousands and thousands of complicated feedback loops. And those feedback loops do things that are very, very hard to anticipate, and so they don't work. But you mentioned Mandami and price ceilings. That's a good example. Price ceilings in the economy is a lot like fire suppression in the environment. And what we found out over the last 100 years was if we put out little tiny fires all the time, what ends up happening is we end up with really big fires. And so we should let those little fires burn so that the big fires don't happen. And that's exactly the kind of thing that happens with price controls, is that how do socialists envision that a price control would actually work? In other words, what does that mean in economic terms? And the problem is it means that somebody buys a building, they try and rent it out, they find out that they can't make any money on it, they can't sell the building because now nobody in their right mind is going to buy the building. So basically what they do is abandon the building. They stop fixing it up and stuff like that. And so the people in the building use all their services and what have you. And worst of all, nobody is going to come in and put in a new building. Because if you're going to, try and put yourself in the place of somebody who would be wanting to put in a building in New York City. Well, you go, okay, I'm going to build this building. I'm going to spend millions of dollars building it. And I'm going to try and rent enough to make my money back. But then the government is going to tell me I can't raise the rents enough to actually get my money back. Well, who in their right mind would invest in that kind of an environment? Well, nobody.
Sorry, you made this small argument, large argument. There's a couple things I want to talk about that you said, including I don't want to forget about going back to the fascist argument because I do have a pretty big disagreement with socialism and fascism being anywhere near each other. But I do want to talk about the small fire, large fire thing, right? Because with Mondani and with what's going on in New York, I would argue that it is a big fire, right? Because the problem is not the individual people that are, that bought a house or built a house and then rent out the house, right? The entire idea behind it was to stop the large corporations that are buying up large swaths of house, large swaths of apartments that are buying them up and then creating an artificial inflation within there, raising prices over and over and creating this higher rent cost. So this isn't a matter of they're losing money. This is the fact that they're making an extreme amount of money on that on those houses to the point where it's pushing out everyday citizens. So I don't think it was trying to be a stint on capitalism as much as a regulation on capitalism.
Well, I don't have a problem with generally regulating capitalism. We need guardrails, but price controls historically have never worked. They've always caused far more problems than they solve because what ends up happening is what's happening in New York has been happening in New York for the last 5 or 6 years, at least, maybe longer, is that there's a housing shortage because nobody's going to go in there and build more housing. That's the reason the prices have gone up so much. It's not because the people are actually charging more. Now they have to charge more. There's inflation, and price controls in New York are not inflation adjusted. And so, like over the past 5 or 6 years, we've got 25% inflation, and the people aren't allowed to raise their rents 25%. So they're losing money. And nobody's going to come in there and fix that because nobody in their right mind would go in there and try and invest.
Well, I mean, we have a housing shortage everywhere across the United States. I mean, like I live in Florida, we're in a housing shortage here, and we don't have any type of rent controls here. I think that the housing shortage problem in the United States is much more significant than just talking about rent controls in New York,
Well,
right?
it's both.
Yeah, go ahead. Mm,
There is a
okay.
housing shortage, definitely. Uh, well, part of it has been caused by the huge increase in immigration. Uh, we have to have houses for people. And so when people come into the country, we have to house them somewhere. And how do you do that? Well, you have to try and build housing. But a lot of the government controls have added so much cost to creating housing that people are disincentivized to actually go do it. Um,
It's funny that you say that immigration thing because there was just a recent study that came out. I believe it was a specific authored by the Federal Bank of St. Louis. And if you actually look into the data of that, it showed that immigration had almost a minute effect on housing. I think it said it was like 30% of a 12% increase, and it was only talking about the Las Vegas level area. And when you actually extrapolated that data over the entire United States, immigration, even during the Biden administration, when it was much higher, had a very negligible effect on housing. So, I mean, I'm going based off of that study, and maybe you have other information, but based off of that study, I'm not seeing how immigration really had that huge negative effect. I believe that the biggest negative effect is just the lack of housing, right? Especially when it comes to new homes, single family homes, and that large swath of immigrants doesn't really affect that because they can't come and get a prime mortgage on a single family house when they well, at least in that amount of time.
yeah, it doesn't. That's the catch, and that's what I meant about talking about feedback loops. Is that it doesn't take a big change to make a big effect. In complex systems, a good example of complex systems, another good example is the weather. A guy named Lorenz was able to prove in the early 70s that we'd never be able to predict the weather more than a week or so out. And one of the reasons, the way he discovered that was what later was called the butterfly effect, which I'm sure you've heard of. In fact, his famous quote was, "Can a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil precipitate a tornado in Texas?" And the answer is yes, because with all these feedback loops, what happens is a tiny, tiny change in input can make a huge change in an output. And that's how he discovered it, is he was running a weather model. And he went out to lunch, and before he went, he had made a small change in an input. He came back and found an entirely different weather pattern and was just shocked by that. And in doing further investigations, he found out that that was always going to happen because, like I mentioned earlier, we've got 9 billion consumers in the country right now. I can't predict what they're going to do. The weather works the same way. There's billions of air molecules out there, and I've got to know what they're all doing before I can predict the weather. And so it's this lack of predictability that is exactly what causes the problem. And that's exactly why research, like, for example, the Fed study you quoted, doesn't really tell us enough because it doesn't tell us what the effect of that will be on all the feedback loops. And particularly since some of those feedback loops are delayed in time. So you do something today and it might not have an effect till a year or 5 years from now. And so like we've learned with the environment, the key here is humility. It's time for us to admit we don't know enough to do this. That we're fiddling with a system that is far too complicated for us to accurately make adjustments to. And like I said, as we learned in dealing with the environment, we found out every time we tried something, we screwed it up.
Trust me, I live in Florida. No one predicts the weather. Okay, we don't know. I can't. AccuWeather can't tell me what the weather is going to be like this afternoon. I promise you that. Okay, that's just how Florida is all the time, right? but I just think it, and look, I'm not saying that immigration didn't have a partial effect on housing, right? I think that all factors had a effect on housing. I think that, you know, the large corporations that are buying up massive houses, not just in New York, in the entire country, I think is one of the more significant ones. I think that, even the housing bill that, that was, well, it's still sitting on the president's desk. I think as of the time of this recording, I think it runs out of time on tomorrow, actually, because we're recording on the 9th. But even then, it looks like, and politicians even agree that, that is a major factor in it based off of the policy that they're putting in. And again, I'm not saying I trust all politicians on whether they know what's going on and what's right. I trust very little of them because they tend to not know very much. I just think and I'm not saying that housing, that rent controls are right all the way across the board. I think in New York they might be different than other places, and I don't know, and I understand where that becomes like kind of a more social thing. Again, I see that more of like a high regulation than I do a socialism thing. But that's me personally. I did want to get back to when you were comparing socialism and fascism. All right, because we look at socialism, right, and the commonly understood, definition of socialism is, the means of production is owned by the people, means of production is owned by the state, depending on, and those can be intertwined together, right, depending on the country. And the definition for fascism, right, is, well, I mean, it's kind of tentative, right? Different experts on fascism define it differently. My understanding is palingenetic ultranationalism, right? That usually fits the 14 tenets that are described and listed out based off of the original concept under Mussolini, right? But I think that when we talk about, the means of production owned by the state to give to the people, I think it's supposed to be, and maybe this is utopian, and like I said, I know that's part of your book. But the idea is that socialism creates a situation in which maybe it is the state that owns it, but the state owns it as a way to make sure whatever comes of that is given back to the people. Where fascism never has that intent. Fascism's entire stance is generally totalitarian, right?
Okay, first of all, let's make a clear distinction.
Sure.
Fascism and socialism do have a couple of differences, but they aren't economic. So you're right. Fascism tends to be nationalist, whereas socialist tends to be worldwide. In other words, Marx's idea was a worldwide system. And the fascists are against that. They want a national system. But then neither of those things have anything whatever to do with economics. In economic terms, they are both called centrally planned economies. That is, the government decides what gets made. And whether they own it or don't own it doesn't even matter. And even in fascism, they try to do it for the people. For example, the Volkswagen was invented by Adolf Hitler. He went to Porsche and said, I've got this idea for what I call the people's car. And here it is, and I want you to make it. And you don't have a choice. You have to make it. And so that's what happened. The Porsche created the Volkswagen Beetle, started a separate company using the German phrase for the people's car, Volkswagen, and that was that. So both fascist governments and socialist governments have tended to, quote, do things for the people. But the problem is that once any group of people takes sole economic power, they never give up, and they end up taking absolute power. And so there has never been a socialist government that didn't evolve into a dictatorship. It's a necessary thing that follows. Because if I say, I decide tomorrow to make a certain kind of cell phone, and I say that's the only kind we're going to make because that's what's best for the people. Now, you decide you don't want that kind of cell phone, so you go buy one from another country somewhere. Now, if I'm running the government, I can't have you buying cell phones from somebody else. So I have to find a way to punish you if you do that. And in fact, look at virtually any socialist country. North Korea is a good example. North Korea has a huge black market. They buy American jeans, American CDs, American movies. They're doing that under penalty of death because people want what they want. They want to decide what they're going to get to buy. And the only way you can do that is in a capitalist society. There's no way around it. At least
Well, I
not.
mean, some of the most social, so like what would be considered socialist countries on the planet right now would be countries like Norway, Sweden, Scandinavian
They
countries.
aren't even a little.
The
They aren't even a little bit socialist. The government has
whoa, hold on. You're gonna say that rent controls in New York are socialists, but what Norway and Sweden do aren't? They control well more of what's going on within the, incredibly high taxes and incredibly high, restrictions on things that are, in the exact same manner that what like Mamdani's doing in New York. So how are you gonna say one's socialist
well,
and one's not?
in the first place, I didn't say it was social. Mandami was
Okay.
socialist. It's more. It's closer to fascism. He isn't taking over ownership. He's taking over control, and that would be fascism, not socialism. But but the Nordic countries have a bigger safety net than the U.S. has, and as a result of that, they have higher taxes. But they have no control whatever over the economy. They have, in fact, right now, economically, those countries are rated freer than the U.S. in economic
That's
terms.
interesting.
That is, and a company like IKEA operates virtually restriction free. They can do anything they want, pretty much. There are far fewer restrictions on IKEA than there are on Microsoft in the U.S.
That I agree with.
And so,
Yeah.
so the Nordic countries are absolutely capitalist countries with a slightly larger safety net. That's basically it.
But that's exactly how I would define democratic socialism when it comes to like Mamdani or AOC or Bernie Sanders. I would describe them in the exact same way because like when you look at like what's going on in the United States, you look at again, I don't want to harp on the rent control things. That was just one that comes to my head, right? Really quickly. We talk about, grocery stores that that are social safety social safety net for those that are below the poverty line. We talk about things like free transportation, free daycare or VPK and stuff like that. I call those strong safety nets. That's how I see them in my. I don't see them as a means of production being taken over because they're not production.
All right. Although I should first of all point out that the Democratic Socialist Party, even on their website, says that their goal is full-on socialism. Their idea is to gradually phase it in. So to talk about democratic socialism as being opposed to actual socialism is to defy what democratic socialists themselves say. When we talk about safety nets, that's a whole different conversation. That's not a matter of socialism, fascism, or anything else. That's a different conversation. What kind of safety nets are good? What kind of safety nets are bad? How do they work? I would suggest that the things that Mandami are proposing, first of all, are not safety nets. In other words, free transportation for everybody is not a safety net. That's free transportation for everybody. It's not targeting people who need help. It's saying we're going to do this for everybody, whether they need help or not. And that's often too often the case with big things by government, is that they don't actually target the people that need help. They throw money at a problem so they can feel good, but they don't really solve the problem. And one of the things he talks about is homelessness, and we have to have shelters. And I would suggest that sheltering people is not the same as giving them a home. A home, the idea of a home is a lot more than just shelter. And so if we're going to try and solve a problem, let's actually try and solve the problem. Let's look at why people are homeless and find a way to change their lives in such a way that they can not be homeless. Because sheltering doesn't solve the problem. I mean, would you want to go live in a homeless shelter? Or are you happy
No,
with your home? I
I
mean,
absolutely wouldn't. I absolutely wouldn't want to go live in a homeless shelter 100%. And I'm thankful for the fact that I don't and I haven't in my life. I have had family members that have and stuff like that. But I don't believe that sheltering, well, for two parts of this, I don't believe that sheltering people is the idea of long-term housing. I believe that sheltering people is a way to get people on their feet because they can't go get jobs. They can't go be more accurate, be more parts of society where they actually do feed capitalism if they don't have a home, right? If you don't have shelter, if you don't have a place to eat, if you don't have food, right? And providing the state providing those things in order to give people a leg up where they can do that. Because like you said, I don't want to live in a homeless shelter. I don't think they want to live in a homeless shelter. The people that are in those shelters, it just gives them the ability to do that. But then that's why we go back to like another policy that came out of New York, right, where they put a huge tax on properties of people, like the housing that for people that didn't actually live in them, like they weren't their primary housing, right? We have these rent controls. Well, now we're giving people a leg up, and we're trying to make the rent more possible for people that are in that situation, that are in those shelters, and we're providing them with transportation to be able to get to their jobs, be able to get to work. So if they don't have that, so now it's not a singular policy that's trying to create a leg up for people. It's all of them combined.
Yeah, but all of those things combined aren't targeted to the people that need it. In other words, all of the things that we've mentioned are things that are broad based. It's not saying that these people, we've looked at these people and we've seen that they need help. So we're going to give them a free bus pass. That's not the same as giving free transportation to everybody. So if you or I go to New York, if Mondami gets his way and puts in free transportation, I get free bus rides too, even though I can easily afford to pay bus fare. And so why should taxpayers be paying for me to take free bus rides? Doesn't make any sense.
Because the taxpayers want to.
Gosh, I've never seen taxpayers that voluntarily.
I mean, Mamdani ran on giving free. He ran on giving free transportation, and he won overwhelmingly. And
He
then
did win overwhelming. He won 51% of the vote, and he did that with only a fourth of New Yorkers voting.
Well, then he won again because there was just 3 more House of Representatives that were voted in Democratic Socialists, and I think a couple of those won by 20 points. After they saw what Mamdani did, they still voted in, Democratic Socialists at a very high level.
There are certainly neighborhoods in New York where that's true. But again, the turnout was ridiculously low. Ridiculously low. So we can't actually say the majority of New Yorkers agree with any of this. Now, I'm not saying they don't. Maybe they do. But we can't quote the elections and say that that's what that means.
By the way, I think 0.25% of anybody voting for a mayoral election is pretty good. I don't think they have, especially in an off election year. I'd have to check my numbers on that.
That means a shade over an eighth of the people in New York voting for Mondami.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of people don't vote, right? So, but anyway, so what's your solution to this, sir? Because I have a feeling, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're going to say that, that capitalism is better, but all of these issues that we're talking about also exist within capitalism now. So capitalism isn't fixing these issues. So what do you say is how do we fix this? How do we get to a better spot? Because I mean, I think you'd admit also that we do have a problem, right?
Of course we have problems. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, okay, it's the question is not a simple question. So
sorry, I realized I didn't mean to lead you when I answered that question. So I apologize.
Don't apologize. That's fine. It's just going to take me a little while to answer it because
please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. The first thing is to recognize that most of the things that we have serious problems with are problems that were actually created by government. So, for example, let's take healthcare. I would be the first one to agree healthcare costs too much. Now, my grandfather was a doctor, and at about the time of his death, he lived in a 3-bedroom house, normal, maybe, I'm going to take a guess and say 1,600 square feet. He had a 6-year-old car and had a normal middle-class life, maybe upper middle class, barely. But what changed? Well, one of the main things that changed was the government got involved in nutrition. They made a food pyramid that was basically made up by 2 people who had no nutrition training at all. And they were able to sell it to the federal government. The federal government made the food pyramid. And if you can look at a graph of it, and you'll see that in about 1980, obesity took off like a rocket because people believed what the government said. They switched over from eating fats to eating carbohydrates. And that caused an obesity epidemic. If you graph obesity versus healthcare costs, they go one-on-one right together. So we've exploded healthcare by telling people to do things differently than they're doing it. Because about 70% of the money that goes into healthcare right now is because of obesity. Because there's tons of people out there in horribly bad shape that are driving up the cost for everybody. That's one example. Another example is student loans. Another big place where people criticize expenses. Again, basically the same thing happened. Around the 1970s, the government decided everybody should go to college, which is a dumb idea to begin with. We need tons and tons of people that don't go to college. We need electricians and plumbers and lots of people. But what the government got in and started throwing money at the problem. Now, what happens whenever a huge amount of money comes into a system is you separate the consumer and the producer. And so when I was in college, I had to, be very, very careful shopping around. What college do I want to go to? What degree do I want to get? Now you've got lots of people getting huge in debt because they don't even know what it's going to cost them, and they don't care because they're just going to take out a loan, and to them that's far in the future. They don't think about it. And another example of separating producer and consumer. I smashed my thumb a month or so ago, and
Sorry to hear that.
had to go to the doctor. And I went in last week, and I have no idea what that cost. There was no way I could comparison shop, find the best doctor, find a doctor that would do it for a price that I could afford. None of that happened. I went in, I paid my $15 copay, and I was out. After the fact, I cannot find out how much that costs. It could cost $500, it could cost $5,000. I have no clue. And so whenever that happens in an economy, bad things result. Really bad things, because capitalism relies on the fact that consumers will comparison shop. And whenever we remove that, and government removes that very frequently, it stops being capitalism and becomes fascist-like. That is, the government is controlling things in a way that keep capitalism from being able to do its job. Now, you asked about steps going forward. Well, there are two huge things I think that need to happen. One is education. We don't train people to live in the current economic environment. We are still training people for an environment that existed 100 or 200 or 300 years ago. And that environment's gone. It just doesn't exist anymore. What should we be teaching people today? Well, here's what we should be teaching people today. Thing number one, we should be helping people find their talent or talents. Now, that's something we don't do in schools, ever. In fact, we subvert that process by not ever failing people. Failure is not a bad thing. Failure is a helpful thing. It teaches us what we're good at and what we're not good at. And so we have to help people find their talents, however we can do that. And the next thing we need to do is help people find their bliss, find what they really love doing. And then we need to help people learn how to do those two things, take their talent and their bliss and find ways to create value for other people. That's the heart of capitalism, is people saying, how can I create value for others? Now, The people that do that will get rich. No doubt about that. Jeff Bezos got rich by creating Amazon. And boy, am I glad he did, because I've run the numbers on that. The average American is $2,000 to $3,000 a year better off because of Amazon. Now, he got rich, but he created huge values for all of us. Huge values. I'm right now on a PC. I don't know what kind of a device you're on, and I'm talking to you on Starlink. We couldn't be having this conversation if it weren't for Elon Musk and Bill Gates. They got rich by creating value for all of us. Try and imagine the value those two men have created, what they've done for the world. And we're going to complain about the money they made by doing that? They got rich by helping the whole world get better. That's not a small thing. That's a huge thing. Now, many of the complaints of progressives are well-founded. One of them is the ability of people with money to affect politics. And that's the other part of the answer that I'd like to go into now. That is, how can we make it so that that doesn't happen? Because I agree with the progressives completely on this one. Having money should not give you an outsized voice. That should happen within the realm of capitalism only, where every day in capitalism, we vote with our money. And that's the way in capitalism is intended to work. But if people that have money can invest in politics, that's a horribly bad thing. How do we stop it? Well, I've got several things we can do to stop it. The first one is make sure all bills expire. That is, whenever you pass a bill, it has an expiration date. Because part of the problems in government is this ridiculous partisanship that keeps things from getting done right. And part of the reason is that politicians have learned that if they get a bill passed, it's going to be impossible to get it out later on. And so they push really hard to make big changes that they hope will fix stuff permanently. So that's the first thing to fix. The second thing to fix is to make every bill require a supermajority. 3/4, 2/3, we could quibble about the exact amount, but if at least 2/3, let's say, of the country doesn't agree with something, how good an idea can it really be? I mean, if we can't get most people to buy into it, is it really that good an idea? And I've got to wonder about that. The next thing is make every bill a single issue bill. Most of the bad stuff the government does, it does by throwing it into a big pot of bills that nobody ever even reads. Half the people voting for them haven't read them. And in fact, Pelosi's famous statement of, you've got to vote for it so we can read it, so we can find out what's in it. Is that really the way we want people running our government? By voting for things that they don't even know what's in the bill? You mentioned a couple of bills that are in the works right now, and I'll be willing to bet the majority of the people that are going to be called on to vote on those bills don't know everything that's in them. Because they're too big. You're talking about bills that are 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 pages long. That's just unworkable. Now, the next thing, and this is what I'm pretty sure that virtually every progressive is going to agree with me on, but we'll see, is to dramatically curtail lobbying. Lobbying is the biggest single evil in our system today. And
I agree. Overturn Citizens United.
Well, I can fix Systems United right now. I can tell you exactly how to do it. I've got a solution. And it's an easy solution. It can happen tomorrow. Citizens United said that money is speech and people have free speech. Okay, that means I have a right to give money. I don't have a problem with that. But there's nothing that says that we can't curtail politicians from taking that money. People have a right to speak, but they don't have an absolute right to be forced to listen. And if money is speech, taking the money is listening to that speech.
Well, the Supreme Court literally just ruled that they can do more listening. We'll put it that way.
Well, all we have to do is pass a law that says every politician can only take, just pick a number, $100,000 in their total campaign.
Well, the Supreme Court just ruled that there's not a cap on giving money to parties, and those parties are able to push that money to their constituents or to their candidates
I
as they see fit.
That's not what I just said. You're missing what I just said. What I just said was put a cap on what the politicians can take, not what the people can give. That's a huge difference. The Supreme Court can't regulate that.
There are countries that do that already. There's actually tons. There's actually quite a few countries that already do that, and they have caps, and they have caps on how long people can run, which also reduces the money, and that's the whole thing. I do want to address a few things that you said there, because you said quite a few things I want to address, and I just don't want to get too far off track. You talked about healthcare. I don't know. I'm a big U.S. soccer fan, so I guess maybe I'm just going to relate it to this. But I do find it find it kind of crazy that you were talking about healthcare and how, and stifling capitalism when it came to that, when it came to education. Every single country that played in the World Cup in the United States had universal healthcare besides us, right? All of those nations would be considered capitalist, or not all of those. Sorry, not all of those nations would be considered capitalist, but a large portion of those countries would be considered capitalist, right? So there's no reason why we can't fix that. And every single time we try to fix that, it's called socialism. Not by you per se, but by people, right? Capitalism is what is destroying our healthcare system. Period. End dot. The ability for private hospitals to exist, for private pharmaceutical companies to charge an overwhelming amount for pills that they don't charge that same amount in other countries that are more regulated, I think is absolutely destroyed our healthcare system. Is obesity a problem? Absolutely, obesity is a problem. Not a question, definitely. I believe that obesity is a problem because also we have chemicals in our food. And the reason why we have those chemicals in our food as opposed to other countries that don't have those same chemicals in our food is because of what you talked about at the end, where we talked about lobbying, where those same, people were able to lobby to keep those things unregulated. So therefore that, those things didn't end up regulated. So we have a whole bunch of stuff that we should have.
It's what you're preaching to the choir.
Oh no, I'm not saying you disagree with me there. So I think that the lobbying thing is huge there. I think where my issue is, and I completely agree, money out of politics. I don't have argument with that. And I think we go well past, stop how much they can take. I think we overturn Citizens United and stop all of these these massive bills from being able to go anyway. Because you mentioned something when you were talking about bills, and you were talking about how everything should have like a three quarters majority in order to vote something in, 2/3, something like that. Well, there was actually a study that was done not too long ago, and it talked about pretty much when it comes to voting in Congress, the reason why 3/4 votes, 2/3 votes don't work is because of the influence of people that are very, very rich, and how when they want something, bills tend to go towards that. And average people, no matter what I want as a generally middle class person, it doesn't matter what I actually want. That's not what they're voting on in Congress, right? So I think that that's also that's a big issue. Now, you said this stuff like, okay, you mentioned Starlink, you mentioned Amazon, and that's where I want to get back to. Elon Musk did not create something that was so awesome in Starlink that we could all use. The taxpayers did, because Elon Musk got $20 billion in subsidies for SpaceX that actually ended up helping him create Starlink. He got USAID funding that helped him create Starlink. The US taxpayer paid for him to become a trillionaire. And I know it's not a paper trillionaire, but paid for him to become a trillionaire by building what we wanted. All that is a middleman, right? We're paying for it. The American taxpayers are paying for it. Then that goes to a middleman, that's Elon Musk, that makes trillions, who then goes and creates a company to which then he pays almost no individual taxes on. Now, SpaceX pays plenty of taxes. I'm not saying
in my book, I answer all that. And one of the answers is the government should not be giving anybody any money to do stuff.
Yeah, but they do though. The situation that we live in, they absolutely do.
I'm not arguing with that.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that.
I'm absolutely against. If the government, anything that the government gives to anybody to go do stuff is wrong. Mm-hmm. The government has no business fiddling around with the economy. And that's part of fiddling around. Now, on the other hand, the government does have a stake in regulating stuff. Like, for example, you said additives in foods. If the government wants to regulate additives in foods, I'm all for that.
Mhm.
And in fact,
Yeah,
they're starting to do that now.
I agree.
And that's right.
Yeah,
Um,
they need to do a lot more of it. They want to do a
they
lot more of
sure
it.
do. I'd be the first one to agree with
Yeah,
that. But those are guardrails. Those are things that keep people from screwing up the economy, keep people from doing bad things. But it
yeah,
isn't a matter of the government doing stuff in the economy. That's the difference. And that's the part that too many people don't understand, is that it's fine to regulate what people can do. It's not fine to mess around in the economy. It's like I mentioned the environment earlier. I'm 100% behind environmental regulation. We definitely need to keep polluters from polluting.
Mhm.
That's great. In fact, I wish we could do a lot more to keep polluters from polluting. That's excellent. But we shouldn't be going in there and killing wolves because we think we can help the deer. That's that's the difference in fiddling with the economy or the environment and regulating it in by preventing people from doing bad things to it. And so if
Yeah,
anybody is messing with the economy, government, individuals, I don't care who they are, if they're trying to change the economy, then we need to stop them. But we have to
yeah.
start by keeping the government from doing it. And so again, I know you don't agree, but if
Well,
I no,
what I was gonna say was what you're saying to me sounds like the same complaint about socialism that you've been talking about, where it's utopian, right? Like it sounds like, oh, all we have to do is get all of the government money out of all tax dollars out of individual economic business, and then all we have to do is get rich people to stop influencing the government and bills, and then we can have this unregulated, complete free market capitalism that exists. That's utopian. That's not that I don't know if that I feel like that really deals with the situation that we're in. And what I feel like is that, and this is my opinion, okay, and this is just my opinion. I feel like we have gone too far in allowing some of these things to happen. And the only way to come back from those things is a regrasp on that regulation, right? And somewhat a regrasp even with the economy. I'm not saying that Jeff Bezos creating Amazon isn't a good thing. Trust me, I probably spend way too much at Amazon. I bought something yesterday. Okay. I'm not saying, but he got rich creating Amazon. He got this rich, okay, through lobbying deregulation, through union busting, through maltreatment of workers that we have tons of study on. He got rich creating a product, and I don't have an issue with that. I have an issue when that person continues to get richer and richer and richer and richer and richer. And I think at a certain point, the government needs to step in and go, okay, if you're going to use these practices in order to get richer, then you're not going to be rich anymore, right? Like if
no,
and
no,
also you should be paying taxes, right?
no,
You should be paying you should not ever be paying a lower tax rate than somebody who makes median household wage in the United States. That's my feeling towards it.
well, taxing is a whole different issue, but I don't know
We don't need to
how.
get into unrealized. I was just
Well,
making I didn't
yeah,
mean to make that
well,
a focal point
that's,
here.
no,
But I
that's
mean, we both are. I think we're both aware of how wealthy people use their unrealized gains
of
in order
course
to get richer and then avoid taxes. I don't think that's a. I think that we can probably both agree that that happens and
yeah,
that exists.
it does. And again, most of the things that you mentioned just now, I would refer to as bad practices. I have no problem with the government preventing bad practices. That's that's not interfering in the economy. The things that I'm concerned about is the tinkering with the economy, and that would include things like regulatory capture, bailouts, tariffs, subsidies, price controls. All of those things are things that screw up the economy. They don't let capitalism work. And the other thing I should point out is that essentially centrally planned economies existed for most of humanity. For the first 50, if you start at the year one, which is the earliest place we have good numbers for, and look at per capita GDP, which is a good measure of how well people are doing. From the year one to the year 1500, per capita GDP did not change at all. And during that time, we had centrally planned economies. That is, somebody was in control of how the economy worked.
Yeah.
And we found out that people didn't get any better at all, not even a tiny bit.
Can I switch subjects real quick? Because I just have something on my mind I would just love to bring up to you. How do you feel about the Trump administration currently owning a 10% stock in Intel?
I think it's terrible.
And they apparently they've been offered a 5% stock in OpenAI also.
It's a really bad idea.
Okay, because it sounds like they're going to continue this, right? It sounds like these are practices that they want to continue.
I think that's the definition of socialism.
Correct.
That's the government owning the means of production, and I'm absolutely against it.
Yeah.
See,
I'm if you wouldn't mind, I just want to tell you something and this is from my experience, and like I said, I'm for very, very strong social safety nets. I don't consider myself a socialist, but I will say this. I do talk to a lot of people that are democratic socialists, right? That exist in Bernie Sanders land and AOC land and Mamdani land. When they talk about their ideals, right? They might say it's socialist. But when they talk about the things that they want, they are not talking Venezuela. They're talking Norway, right? They're not talking North Korea. They're talking Sweden, right? And so I think that I think we're kind of in this position right now, and I'll let you tell me whatever you think about this. I think we're in this position where, especially a lot of the younger generations, right, are contrasting a lot with some of the older generations, because the older generations remember, like, the Red Scare, right? Like, we're talking, USSR, the whole thing around there. Sir, I wasn't trying to call you old, sir. I
am. I'm 78, and I'm not ashamed of that.
I'm kind of in between. I'm a millennial. I'll be 40 this year, right? And so I have my own different thought process about it. But what you see is a lot of people that are coming up in democratic socialism. They're in their 20s, right? And what they see is countries that have universal health care. They see countries that have these incredibly strong social safety nets. And DSA is offering a possibility of a solution to fixing the lack of social safety nets that exist in the United States, in comparison to some of those other, more, those other nations, some of those more free nations, right, according to the Freedom Index, right? How do we kind of juggle that, right? Because I think that if you told anybody, like, hey, if you're saying you want socialism, you mean we're going to turn into North Korea? I think 99.9% of people are like, we don't want that, right? But if you tell people, hey, we want to be like Norway, we want to be that form of of socialism, which I think is what a lot of them mean, I think a lot of people are going to agree with that. So how do we balance what I think is possibly just a misunderstanding of rhetoric?
Well, yeah, I would say that's the first thing that needs to happen, is to clean up the rhetoric. You can look online and find it. I don't remember the prime minister of one of the Nordic countries gave a big speech in which we are not democratic socialists.
Mm-hmm.
They'd say they are not. I think here's where the problem comes in. They call themselves social democracies. Mm-hmm. And somehow that's been twisted around to be democratic socialists. But democracy and socialism are incompatible. You cannot have democratic socialism, because if the means of production is owned by the government, you're out of luck. Now, and if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to where I was a minute ago, though.
Absolutely. Can I just make one comment on that, and I'll let you go back? All I was going to say is, I actually think that people like Bernie Sanders aren't actually democratic socialists. I believe they're social democrats. That is what I actually believe. But please go back to your point. And I think I just want to say that because I think it might actually help to fix the rhetoric.
I think
in the future.
Yeah, I think some of that is true. Although he has recently advocated for taking government control of parts of the economy. The government.
I'm talking more traditional Bernie. Bernie's been saying some some other stuff
Old
lately.
version, not
But
new.
yeah. But anyways, please go back to your
But
point. I
anyway,
apologize.
no, that's cool. Back to 1500. Let's look at what actually did change. Well, between 1500 and 1800, capitalism started being born. The people began actually investing. And that's what capitalism is really about. Like I run, I lift weights. Why do I do that? Particularly at my age, when I could be just laying on a beach somewhere. I do that because I'm investing for the future. I know that if I do that today, I'm probably going to have a longer, healthier life going forward. And that's the nature of capitalism. When people are arguing with capitalism, what they're saying is you shouldn't be able to invest for the future. That's what capitalism really is. And what happened between 1500 and 1800 was per capita GDP went up 40%. In just 300 years, far more progress was made than in the last 1500. Now then in 1800, something dramatic changed. The United States. A country was actually built on capitalism. We were the first country to have patents in the Constitution. Patents make a huge, huge difference in what people are willing to invest. Because why would you pour a huge amount of money into something if somebody else can go out and take it from you? And what happened then? Well, between 1800 and now, the entire world is 18 times better off, measured by per capita GDP, than it was in 1800. That's the result of nothing except capitalism. And in the US, we are 40 times. I see that you're suspicious, but you can check the numbers. This is
We
all.
also invented this scientific method during there. I would say that that's probably a pretty big. I think the world's a lot better off doing things like.
But that's exactly what
the invention of modern science.
That's what capitalism caused. It was capitalism that did that. That wasn't an accident. It was because of the potential investments in capitalism that people started investing in science. It didn't happen just by magic. And what I was going to say next was, though, that in the U.S. and most of the developed world, it's now 40 times better off than it was in 1800. So we're not talking about tiny things. And even in the recent past, in 1950, 39% of the world was in extreme poverty. Now it's 9%. As more and more countries become capitalist. Because capitalist does things in a way that most people can't envision. If you look at back in 1500, the rich were evil. I completely agree with that. But too many people are still stuck in that mindset. That's where Robin Hood came from. Why? Because back then per capita GDP stayed the same. What does that mean? It means if I want more, I have to take it from somebody else. What capitalism does is it says, I'm not going to get more by taking it. I'm going to make more by growing the economy. What capitalism does is it grows the economy and makes everybody better off. You know, you mentioned earlier people comparing themselves with the older generation and thinking, well, we had it so much better than you guys. They're hallucinating. I was in a middle-class family. My family of 6 grew up in a house with 961 square feet. Okay. By today's standards, that's almost a tiny home. We had no central heat. We had a radiator in every room. We had no air conditioning of any kind, not central, not even a window air conditioner. My dad never had a new car in his life. We had a phone with a party line, which meant I'd have to pick up the phone and go, is anybody on there? No, okay, so I can make a call.
I even grew up with that. So.
Yeah. And so
I'm aging myself, I guess, a little bit over.
So people today, when they say housing costs more, if you actually adjust it for the number of people in a house and the features that come in that house, housing is cheaper today than it was then. Because you're getting a whole lot more house for a whole lot fewer people. The average house today is 2,500 square feet. For 2.5 people on average. So you've got the house I lived in, about 1,000 square feet, with 6 people living in it, versus a house that's more than twice the size with a third of the people living in it. So yeah, does the house cost more? Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh no, I think that people talk about that situation on a multitude of things, but I think it a lot relates to the fact that it's job availability and job scarcity, like when it comes to and how well that job is able to provide, right? I mean, back in that time, generally people got pensions. That's pretty much gone, right? Like it's all um just in it's all 401ks and IRAs and stuff like that, right? I mean, we even had a much higher nominal tax rate when it comes, or corporate tax rate, right? When it came to businesses took care of their people. Businesses don't take care of their people anymore, right? Like, and this is why you're like, people say that rich people are evil. Well, people are seeing it, right? Like when you have Jeff Bezos making all of this money, and his factory workers are having to pee in bottles because they're not allowed to have bathroom breaks, right? Luckily that's stopped now. That sounds pretty evil to me, right? Like
Well,
that
again,
sounds pretty evil.
I have no problem with the government saying you have to give people bathroom breaks. The tendency is to conflate the two things and think that because I know for sure that capitalism can provide far more benefits than any other system, that means that I'm not in favor of having regulations on how people behave. I'm totally in favor. The example I put in my book is if somebody's breaking into your house and starting to steal stuff, and you call the police show up and help the burglar load stuff into his car. I'm going to be upset with the burglar, but I'm going to be a lot more upset with the police. That's the difference I'm talking about, is that while it makes some sense to blame the burglar, it makes a lot more sense to blame the police. And so the problems that we're having are not the problems of Bezos, they're the problems of government. If Bezos is doing stuff that's wrong, the government should stop him from doing that. Now, I should point out that one of the things you said is grossly incorrect. Corporate tax rates, there is no such thing. You cannot tax a corporation. It's impossible. The only thing a corporation is allowed to do by law is pass that along to the consumer. So whenever you tax a corporation, you're simply imposing a flat tax on that company's products. And that flat tax will more affect the poor than it will the rich, because it's a flat tax. And the corporation has no choice. Corporate regulations say that they cannot do anything except pass it on to the consumer. They cannot, they're forbidden by law from doing anything else. They can't disadvantage the stockholders as a result of the tax being raised on the corporation. And that's another thing about economics that too many people don't understand. It's easy to say tax the corporations, they've got lots of money, but it's illegal.
I mean, even if they pass it on, that would disadvantage the stockholders, so it doesn't really matter. I mean, if I have to pass on a 10% tax onto the consumer as opposed to a 20% tax on the consumer, then that's still going to create a situation in which people buy less of my product, which will inevitably disadvantage the stockholder anyway.
That's allowed. They can pass it. What they can't do,
Sounds like it gets to the same point to me.
Okay. Well, there's a huge difference. If you own stock, let's say you're making a 1% dividend every year. If the corporation is taxed, they can't take half of your dividend away. That's illegal. As a stockholder, they can't take that tax increase out of your dividend. Now, you're right. It may indeed be that passing that along to the consumer may indeed disadvantage the corporation in some way, but it'll only disadvantage it compared to corporations that don't have to pay that tax rate. So if you're raising all corporate taxes, then it doesn't disadvantage them because everybody has to pay that same tax rate. So the cost of everything will go up.
Yeah, and my argument was not that we should tax corporations more. I don't make that argument. I was just making the argument that the corporate tax rate was higher back then than it
That's
is
fine.
now. That's the only thing I was saying. Like, I'm not concerned about corporations because I actually really I think that specifically small corporations, right? Small businesses, people with, your, I'm not even just saying like mom and pop shops, but like your general, corporations. I think they are good. I very much encourage it. I think they generally take care of their people better, right? I think that they generally, provide better perks and stuff to their people. I believe that they're not as evil as you so like called I said it. I believe that they have, that they have somewhat of an identity towards it, right? I think that just so at a certain point we've allowed corporations in the United States to become so unregulated and so big that we've just gotten to a point that we have to get it back under control. And I think if we don't, then I think that this problem is just going to keep progressing because as long as they are still in control, they're going to keep pumping money into our political system. And as they keep pumping money into our political system, that takes away the ability for our legislature to be able to ever legislate that to stop, right? And so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that just cycles over and over and over and over and over. And something's got to change. And the level of regulation that exists within our capitalism right now doesn't feel like it's going to.
And I'm agreeing with that. The big difference that I see is that you said that what I was doing was idealistic, utopian.
I do think it's utopian, yeah.
And
Or what you not what you're
I
doing,
guess,
but what you're saying. I do believe
I
that.
guess
Yeah.
what I would say is they're both utopian.
Maybe.
And,
Maybe.
so the question becomes, which utopia is a better utopia? And I would argue that mine is the better utopia. If we indeed get the government under control so that it doesn't mess around with the economy and let capitalism do what capitalism does better than anything that's ever been tried, we would have a far better system than the system that's envisioned by democratic socialists or social democrats or whatever you want to call them. Because what I envision is a world where you don't have any poor people. And I think that's doable, but not because government makes them not poor, but because we help them get the things they need to not be poor. We help them get the skills, the talents, the abilities to do things to keep them from being poor. And that's what government never does for people. It doesn't really help the people. It creates a circumstance that keeps them in poverty. And
And I,
I'm
but
against that.
yeah, and I guess my argument would be I don't think that, and this is my personal belief, right? I think my utopia doesn't look like either of those things. I don't think it exists completely in socialism. I don't think it exists in a complete capitalistic society. I think it exists in something that is somewhere in between those two things. Mine exists where your hospitals are socialists, but your stores are capitalists, right? Like where where the government owns the utilities that exist so you don't get price gouged on your electricity, and at the same time you can still exist in an environment where invention thrives, where people can come up from the bottom. A socialist a socialist spot where the bottom is lower, or sorry, the bottom is higher, and then a capitalism from there. And maybe that's the most utopian thing of everything we've said
Well,
that
no,
exists in this entire thing.
and I
But
and I
that would
I
be my
understand that.
utopia, I think.
I understand that, and I would be okay. Let's go to your healthcare thing. I would be absolutely opposed to the government owning the hospitals. What
Mhm.
you would end up with is horrible healthcare because
I lived in Italy. They do there.
and
It's
and
really good.
and Italians come here for healthcare
Not at that high of a rate, really.
because the not enough of them can afford it, but those who can afford it come here.
Yeah, if you can afford it, again. But we're not, again. I'm not talking about, again, in my system. The hospitals are owned by the government, but if you wanted to go out and get private healthcare, you could. Like, I'm not saying anybody would be stopped from
Okay,
doing that. They
okay.
could still go and get that.
So you're saying that some hospitals would be owned by the government and others would be private.
Correct. It's a raising of the floor. Nobody in the United States goes bankrupt, which is still the number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States right now, is healthcare, right? nobody in the United States goes bankrupt because anybody can go to the hospital and get healthcare, right? Which I think also fixes the food problem that we talked about before. Because if the government has a vested interest in people's healthcare, then they're not going to allow corporations to continue to poison us with the chemicals in there. So I think that solves that problem. But I also believe, hey, if you want to go out and if you are wealthy enough where you can afford your own private doctor, you don't want to wait in the waiting room, and you want to be able to go and have a doctor that comes to your home or to a private clinic, I believe you should be able to do that also. I believe that's what United States exists to have, where we should be able to raise that floor to a point where nobody is struggling because of it. And also,
Well,
and I'll bring this back to the school thing real quick. And I'm gonna end their interview in a sec because we've been on for a while, and for my partner comes up here and comes and gets me. But but the school thing too. I'm not saying that I think that all college should be affordable, but I think that all trade schools should be affordable. You know what I'm saying? I think that we should, like you were talking about with education, when kids are in high school, we should find out what they're actually good at, what they actually enjoy, what they're actually going to succeed at. We don't need everybody to be a doctor or a lawyer. We need everybody to succeed in those things. And I believe that we should be able to make it affordable for people to be able to go to school to do those things. And I believe that hopefully, and again, this is where I get really utopian. I would hope that if and I'm not saying that a doctor and a plumber should make the same amount of money, but I would hope that no matter which one of those skills that they gained in that situation, they'd be able to live a certain level of life without being into poverty, without the fear of bankruptcy, without the reliance on credit cards, without the fear of one medical emergency, so, like taking them out. That's my utopia. I maybe you disagree, but
no. Well, I mean, I guess the way I would put it is, I don't disagree with where your heart is. I don't disagree with the general concept. What I disagree with is how to get there. Like, for example, in healthcare, rather than owning the hospitals, it would be a lot more easy to convince me that if somebody's in some sort of dire straits, we should be able to help them afford healthcare. That's different than taking ownership of the hospital. And it solves your problem either way. It doesn't make any difference who owns the hospital as long as they get healthcare.
I think it does. I think it does matter. I think when the entire point of the hospital is to make money, when there is a bottom line, then that changes the idea between that in which a government, and I'm not saying this government, I'm saying our government, when the government's job is to help its citizens without making a dollar on that healthcare, it changes the entire way in which the healthcare is exhibited, right?
Yeah, it should not work as well.
I disagree. And maybe this because I lived in Italy and I had a really bad injury when I lived there, and I got to do that. Those doctors still cared immensely. They still cared. They still made good money. Like the doctors still made well above your average salary in Italy, but it was still a state-run hospital. So I think that people that go out to be doctors, if the doctors are going to be a doctor just because of the money they make, they're not as good at doctors as doctors that go into being a doctor because they truly care about people. That's what, like, and maybe I'm wrong in that. Maybe it's just the smartest minds go to become doctors and do that. But maybe this is where we get that education thing in, right? We find out who really wants to be a doctor. Dr. Cardell, I am going to end the show. I really appreciate you for coming on the show. I would love to have you back on. We'll have to finish this conversation.
Sure,
Maybe
anytime.
another time. I'd love to have this. Everyone out there, thank Dr. Cardell. If you'd like to check out his book, again, it's called Why Socialism Struggles: Exposing the Economic Errors That Undermine Utopian Ideals. The link to that book will be in the description of the podcast, along with where you can find him and his socials and all that sort of stuff. So thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you. I hope you have a wonderful day. All right, Doctor?
It's been fun.
Thank you for listening to the Polypolitics podcast on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.